So the last presenter is Marco Cavalieri. Marco is, I think, known of most of you, if not all of you, head of public health threats here at the agency. And you and I, Marco, we belong to the group of people who talks about when the next pandemic comes and not if it comes. So therefore, we ask you to talk about how are we tackling the next pandemic? And yes, we can, so we can end on a positive note here. Marco, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. And indeed, you know, the motto here of this 30th anniversary is "the future is now," which is great. But here, you know, do we really want the future to be now? Because believe me, another pandemic will happen. Epidemics will happen. So we need to be prepared for that. And we need really to work in the direction of doing the best we can to tackle the emergencies of the future. Why am I saying that? Well, first of all, epidemics and pandemics have always occurred since human beings have been living on this planet. That's what we know from the past. But what we know that we are making changes to our planet that will impact on the frequency of these emergencies and these epidemics. First of all, as you see clearly here on the left, the world is becoming quite crowded. You know, the population has been really increasing massively in the last 100 years and is going really stepping up in the future. So we need to think about that, because the more people are around, the more chances are that transmissible diseases will be expanding and causing emergencies or new waves of infection. So that is a fact of life that we have to cope with. The other point is that, of course, what we are doing to the planet, you know, deforestation, destruction of the wildlife haven, all this will lead to more chances that a number of these pathogens that are living placidly within the wildlife could come to us and could cause new problems. And then, of course, global warming. And, you know, it's not about, you know, temperature is growing 1 degree, half degree, and all the debate that is going on in the world. Look at the mosquitoes. The Aedes albopictus mosquitoes, which are the one that carries viruses such as dengue or chikungunya, now they have come as north in Europe as Brussels and Berlin, which means that in a few years we'll be here, maybe in this room. We will have the Aedes albopictus around us. And with them, the virus will come along. So we need to think about the fact that the future, in this sense, might be more problematic or more complicated. So we really need to think about the fact that in the future, we will have more chances of seeing epidemics than what we've seen so far. Another point that, you know, I could not resist talking about is SARS-CoV-2 and the origin of the virus. Now, as you know, there are some people in the world that think that, you know, if you shut down laboratories that are doing research on viruses and you get rid of this called gain of function type of work, then we will not have a problem with pandemics in the future. Well, we should not fool ourselves. The reality, as the papers that are, you know, on this slide are showing, is that the ancestor of SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2 have been found. And these viruses, they live in China and Laos. And they live there since many, many years. Actually, the virus that they gave rise to SARS-CoV-2 was around in these regions between 1 and 5 years ago. What was really astonishing is that, you know, these viruses, they are commensal to the horseshoe bats, which are a certain type of bats. And again, they live in their gut and the oropharyngeal tract of these bats without causing any problem. You know, there is no issue there. The problem is when the bats get in contact with intermediate species, and there is a lot of wildlife still there. And then, you know, these intermediate species are the one that then led to the transmission, or most likely is the real reason of the pandemic with COVID-19. So essentially, the virus was in the bats in that part of China, and then all of a sudden, because of intermediate host that was pretty much identified for SARS-CoV-1, but not yet for SARS-CoV-2, ended up with a virus that also replicated in the mammals, so really adapting to mammals, and then gave rise to a virus that was the one that caused the pandemic. So we really need to put efforts in continuing the work in laboratories, not stopping this important work on gain of function, but also complement this with work on surveillance. So the so-called One Health concept that Sandra mentioned before is extremely important. We really need to continue surveillance, understanding what is happening out in the wildlife, and really spot and monitoring what is happening with all these viruses. And I will just quote SARS-CoV-2 also because what these researchers discover, that there are hundreds of sarbecoviruses, so coronaviruses similar to SARS-CoV-2, that are living in the bats in this region. All of them could cause a pandemic. And there are thousands of coronaviruses in bats all over the world that could cause a pandemic in the future. And this is just one example. There are many others. Avian flu, you heard a lot about already today, so I will not enter into that. But there are many pathogens that could cause problems in the future, and we need to be prepared on how to deal with all of them. So now is the problem statement and why we need to take action. So what are we doing here at DMA and what we have been doing? So here at DMA, as you heard, there has been an emergency task force that was already creeping up over the years. It started working actually in 2009 with the influenza pandemic at that time. It was very embryonic, but was a new way of working within the European regulatory network. So about disruptive regulation is also how you organize ourselves and how we do the work in Europe is very important to look into new approaches and new way of working. And the emergency task force, as you know, started working at the beginning of a pandemic, even without a legal mandate, simply based on an health threat plan that, by the way, the EMA had, was one of the few institutions in the world that had an health threat plan already established just before the pandemic, so probably we were lucky, but it was there. And so we could activate that and start working straight away through the emergency task force and conducting a lot of activities on how to handle the pandemic. But I'm not here to talk about the lesson learned of what we've done. I'm here to say that the emergency task force now is established and it has an important role in looking into whatever is popping up, whatever it will be coming, whatever the future might bring us in terms of epidemics and pandemics, and be as prepared as we can. So doing all the work that is needed in order to have Europe and the world better prepared to face future emergencies. And it's not just pandemic and epidemics, which, it's Mother Nature's that will bring to us, sometimes instigated by human beings and by what we do to the planet Earth. But it's also about the direct effect of humans. And that's why we're dealing with the so-called CBRN spectrum, which is chemical, biological, and radionuclear, which is very important because, the world is very unsettled. There is a lot of wars going around, and we don't know what the future will bring. So we need to think about also the possibility that some of this threat will come deliberately from release from human beings or from an accident, like, a nuclear disaster. So we need to think about that, and that's what the ETF is doing, to really think how we can be better prepared in having the right medical countermeasure to face all this issue. And then there is this big topic of antimicrobial resistance that is so big that I will not even dare to enter into that because it will dedicate, an entire symposium. But and you heard today how important it is. Maria, Sandra, among others mentioned that. So we need also to work on that spectrum of what is called the silent pandemic, which is not silent at all because people are dying when there are no antibiotics available that work. So we need to do something on that. And even if it's moving at a slow pace, it's not like COVID-19, something abrupt that, involves millions of people straight away, but still is there and is a real problem. So we need to do something about that. And the emergency task force really works in three key areas. The first one is to provide scientific advice and support to developers, to academia, to whoever has a good idea of advancing a medical countermeasure that could help us in dealing with these emergencies. And you see here some figures which, when I read them, I still don't believe that we had like 250 plenary meetings during COVID-19, and we processed, some of them was bit of a fast process, I would say, but 270 therapeutics and 80 vaccines. These, are incredible figures and really shows that in a pandemic such as COVID-19, the amount of work that will come to DMA is impressive. And we need to find a good way to process all of these and to work through to make sure that the best candidates can advance as rapidly as possible. And now we are continuing this work on scientific advice because preparedness is key, as I will say at the end, and we need to make sure that medical countermeasure, vaccines, monoclonal antibodies, antivirus get advanced as much as possible so we have them on the shelf to be prepared for the next emergency. And then scientific reviews. We did a lot of scientific reviews during COVID-19. You remember every day there were hundreds of papers coming out as preprint, and we had to look at them also because sometimes journalists ask us about papers that we are not read yet. So, was really a race in getting out with the information as rapidly as possible. But you remember hydroxychloroquine? Well, That's something that I'm very proud of, because the EMA has been the first agency in the world to come out with a clear statement. It was May 2020, when you remember on the other side of the Atlantic an emergency use authorization was granted, to say don't use hydroxychloroquine except in a randomized clinical trial. And we were the one to go out with this loud and clear message. And that's what the ETF should be doing. That's what we should be doing as European network. Come up with clear recommendation to patients and people all over Europe and all over the world. And I have to say, you know, Thomas, that if we had some organoids, maybe with a sprinkle of artificial intelligence, probably we would have understood that hydroxychloroquine was not even a good agent to start with and should not have been even prioritized for clinical trial. But that is another topic, and we will have to deal with that. But of course, we need to take into account the innovation that comes from this type of approaches and use it more in the future, because that's the way to go. And then giving scientific recommendation, we made a lot of recommendations on the use of the vaccine, jointly also with the European CDC. And also recently, for example, the ETF came out with a recommendation on how to adapt the COVID-19 vaccine, which COVID is still around, you know, it's not a threat as it was in 2020, but still, you know, for elderly people and immunocompromised, it's still a threat. So we need to protect them, and we need to think how to protect them in the best way possible. And that's what we are doing through the ETF. So come out with this recommendation, which again, is outside the ordinary of what the EMA used to do. It's something new, but so badly needed. European citizens want to hear a strong voice from European institutions that is credible, that is science-based, and help them in understanding which medicine to use and how. And then, you know, the pandemic is over. We had the fantastic, you know, achievement of having vaccines approved in 10 months. So, you know, we never seen such a fast development. And again, no corners were cut. All the clinical data that we need were there. Simply everything moved at a pace that was before we had never seen it. And that was great, but that was 10 months, and it looked like something very difficult to beat. Now, the idea that has come up, and this is a document also coming from the G7, G20, is the goal of getting vaccines, diagnostics, and antivirals approved in 100 days from the start of an epidemic or a pandemic. Well, this makes us regularly a bit anxious, because, you know, to get there is not easy. But this is aspirational, and I like the challenges, so we need to work on that, and we need to think how we can get as close as possible to achieve these 100-day missions. How this is going to be done? So let's think about the so-called pathogen X, which is, you know, the unknown, and a new pathogens that will cause a pandemic. SARS-CoV-2 was a bit of a pathogen X, because it was not really on the radar of most of public health authorities. And therefore, you know, how we can get as close as possible to the 100-day mission. So the concept is to advance prototype vaccines and monoclonal antibodies for defined priority viral families. So in other words, the WHO, with a group of experts from all over the world, and we participated to that, defined 12 viral families that are the one that most likely will give us a virus that will cause an epidemic or a pandemic. And then within the families, single viruses were selected as prototype viruses and used them to build vaccines and monoclonals. And this is taken into account with all the new technologies that we have. And you see here on the slide some example, you know, using a single lymphocyte B to select a new monoclonal antibody, use the new way of constructing antigens. For example, do you know that for SARS-CoV-2, essentially, most of the developers use a way of designing the surface antigen of this virus using the experience with the respiratory syncytial virus. So stabilizing the conformation in a so-called pre-fusion conformation, which gives better immunity. All this is very important, because taking together all this scientific advancement, we can be faster in coming out with this prototype vaccine in peacetime, and maybe get to the point that they can be approved, and at the ETF we are ready to support this and to see how far we can go. Ideally, and I think this is really the ambition, is that for some of them we can come even to an approval. And this I have to say we'll have to rely on animal models of infection because it's very difficult to do otherwise today. I don't know, Thomas, let's see in the future, but for now we are really stuck with that. But the idea is really to advance as much as possible so that the prototype vaccines and monoclonal gets approved. And then when the pathogen X arrive, which will be different but belonging to the same viral family, it will be closely related. So with some few adjustments, we will end up with having the vaccine and the monoclonals that we want. And that will take less time. That will take less clinical trials and less evidence. So that is the entire strategy that we are working on in an international landscape, of course, and that's what we are aiming to do in order to be better prepared for the future pandemics and really try to achieve this 100-day mission. And of course, international collaboration. You know, the adage goes that no one is safe until everybody's safe. So that's true. And we at DMA, we always work internationally, and during the pandemic, we had fantastic example of international collaboration. I'm quoting here with the ICMRA, which is a great platform for international discussion. Agencies from all the continents in the world are represented there. And it was fascinating that during the pandemic, we felt it was so difficult to have an agreement globally with all the regulators in the world on the study design for new vaccines for COVID-19. And you remember this also, the media were picking up on this and tried to look into differences. And, you know, at the end of the day, everybody agreed. So we came out from that workshop with the entire world agreeing on the study design for vaccines and for therapeutic in another workshop for COVID-19. And that was great. That's what we need to achieve during a pandemic. We need to achieve global alignment to the extent possible. And then, you know, another example is this one, because now there is, after the WHO defined this viral family, there has been the creation of these collaborative open resource consortia, one for each viral family. And for example, here I'm putting up the one on flaviviruses, so you know, dengue, Zika, and all these nasty viruses that are mosquito driven. And Fiocruz in Brazil is the lead of this cork, and EMA is in the lead of the regulatory activities for this cork, which is extremely important. And we are involved in many other corks. So really here is international collaboration with the regulators, but also with the research community at length. So we need to work with all the world in all different areas of research and development. And that's what we're doing, and that's what we need to continue doing for the sake of a good response in the future. And then let's not forget about, you know, re-emergent infectious diseases. Mpox, that is a very good example. Mpox re-emerged because simply the vaccination campaigns for smallpox, which led to the eradication of smallpox, big success of vaccination, you know, eradicating a disease such as smallpox, believe me, it's a really great achievement. But then, you know, once smallpox was eradicated, of course the vaccination campaign stopped because there was no need to vaccinate people for smallpox. And then what happened that in the DRC, when Mpox is around, this came up again, particularly in younger people, because younger people were not vaccinated for smallpox, they get cross-protection also for monkeypox, and therefore, you know, Mpox re-emerged. So we need to also keep in mind that if we don't want viruses to re-emerge, we need to maintain our capacity of keeping them down or avoiding that, you know, they will come back. And a very good example is polio. Polio, we have seen polio in wastewater surveillance. So you heard today about the relevance, you know, after COVID-19 of doing this wastewater surveillance. And polio has been spotted, you know, in Spain. Many cities in Germany had polio spotted in wastewater. And polio dries very fast, is extremely transmissible. So can you think, if we do not maintain our vaccination coverage of our children, what is going to happen? Polio will come back. And it will be an unacceptable tragedy if we see even a single child dying of polio, which is a completely preventable infectious disease by vaccination. So we need to maintain our efforts on the value of vaccinations, the importance that children, elderly, adults continue to be protected with the vaccines that we have, and we should not lower the guard at all. And we should resist of any miscommunication or misleading message on science here. So very important that we don't forget sight of this. Then moving to another topic very rapidly, which is very important for us at DMA, clinical trials. During the pandemic, there were so many clinical trials conducted that were of poor quality, unable to answer any question, completely useless for patients, researchers, and authorities. And all these studies were approved, get rapid approval, while the big studies that were multi-country, that were able to answer many questions, had a lot of issues in getting approval. So this is something that we need to change radically. We need to do better, particularly in an emergency, to have timely clinical trials run, conducted, and delivered so that we know what to say to citizens and to patients about what to use and what kind of drug to use. And here at the EMA, we are taking a lot of activities. It all started with an important workshop with the scientific community and with many public health authorities about what happened during COVID-19, but also during Mpox, because during the wave of Mpox in 2022, we see also a big difficulty in running large clinical trials in Europe. So we need to do better, and you heard from Maria, ACT-EU. ACT-EU has a priority action on clinical trials in public health emergencies, and we are working hard here to make sure that we have a more flexible approach to the approval of clinical trials, a faster process, a streamlined process, and also this concept of a one-stop shop in which developers, investigators, academia come to us through the ETF and get a feedback that includes not only the view of the ETF, but also the national competent authorities that have to approve the clinical trials, and also from ethics advisory group, because we also want to embed there the view of the ethics committee. We don't want to end up with something that maybe is okay for us and for the clinical trial unit in the member state, but then the ethics committee a problem, because that will stop the process. So we need to do better, and this concept of centralizing at least the advice in order to make sure that there is clarity by all parties about what is needed is so important. And then, the fragmentation in terms of conducting clinical trials in Europe has been a big issue. We need to do better. We need to work with European institutions, with DG ERA, with RTD, with Santé, in order to make sure that we have a good framework for coordinating clinical research and prioritizing really the clinical trials that will give the answer that we need as rapidly as possible. So we are really working hard on this, and I'm quite optimistic that we will see much progress in this area and Europe could do better. And then another important point, clinical trials are essential, but also it's important about other type of evidence that needs to be collected during an emergency, such as a pandemic. And you remember very well during COVID-19 when we were thinking about when to give booster doses for the vaccines, when is the right time, should we change the composition? Well, we all relied on these effectiveness data that were coming from our other regions outside of Europe, Israel, UK, US. How can it be that in Europe we are not able to conduct this type of studies? We should be able to do that. We need to be able to do that. And therefore, together with the European CDC in a joint venture, we established this vaccine monitoring platform. There is really the ambition of creating a large network across the European Union so that we can conduct very rapidly this type of effectiveness studies or on safety of vaccines, so that we can understand how to use the vaccine, how to inform the public, how to inform the people in Europe about how to use this type of medicinal product. And here, this example is quite emblematic because it's after COVID, it was Mpox. And in 2022, we approved this vaccine, Imvanex, for Mpox, but there were no really efficacy data then. And we wanted to have some data coming in terms of vaccine effectiveness, but there were no funds available in the European system to fund these studies. So we were blocked. We could not do much. So the EMA bravely took the opportunity and the burden to fund this study. And this study delivered data that is extremely important. Charité in Berlin was the principal investigator of the study. And this study really told us what we expected, that the vaccine is effective, and even a single dose, because it's a two-dose regimen, even a single dose provides more than 60% protection. And this is really important. So we need to establish this in Europe. We need to establish our capacity of conducting these studies during emergencies and also in peacetime, I would say. So the key message is that we got now the ETF, which is legally established with a new mandate, and these are new tools to facilitate and accelerate the approval of medicines during emergencies and building on the experience on COVID and Mpox. Preparedness is really key, and that's why we're really working on this coordination of activities, which is in Europe. It's not just industry, it's also academia, and it's international, and we need to work on this in a very flexible way to get meaningful results. really facilitating large multinational studies is the direction that we should be taking. We need to have the infrastructure, the networks, and the capacity of the regulatory networks of rapidly approving these studies whenever an emergency comes up. That is the only way to generate robust evidence as rapidly as possible and improve coordination and collaboration. As I said, with academia, we're working a lot, but also with non-governmental organizations, SEPI, Gates Foundation, and other EU bodies, of course, national competent authorities. I think during COVID, we had fantastic interaction with the member states and at different level, public health authority, regulators. That needs to be continued and it needs even to be improved. So there is a lot to be done, but we know what to do. And that's what we're going to do. So the mantra was, is, and will be that an effective response comes only with effective preparedness. If we will be able to put resources, funds, efforts there, we will make it. And we will, what we did already with COVID, we will do again and again and even better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. I think you answered the question, yes, we can. I feel confident. I think we have a single question, or maybe more, but I think we have time for a single question here about the WHO Pandemic Treaty. Is it part of getting more tools in the toolbox?
I think it does. You know, I think it's very important that we have a treaty. And for me, the bottom line is not the treaty itself, but the fact that countries in the world understand the importance of working together. And working together has to be built on trust. So if we trust each other, we will be able to do it. And that's the principle in the pandemic treaty. So that's why I see this very positively, because it's an open door to really foster this climate of collaboration and trust. Without that, I don't think we will go very far in terms of pandemic preparedness.
Completely agree. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you.
Thank you.